The crisp autumn air of Washington, D.C. carried the weight of anticipation as Kim Kardashian stepped out of her black SUV in front of the Apostolic Nunciature. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and the quiet residential street seemed worlds away from the usual chaos that surrounded her life. She pulled her modest navy blazer closer, a stark contrast to her usual fashion choices, and took a deep breath. "Are you sure about this, Kim?" asked her assistant, Tracy, who had been unusually quiet during the drive from their hotel. Kim nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I have to be here. This isn't about publicity or business. This is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "This is about something bigger than me." The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, delivered not through her usual channels of managers and publicists, but through a small Catholic charity in Los Angeles, where she had quietly been volunteering for the past year. The work there, serving meals to homeless families, reading to children in shelters, had begun as court-ordered community service following a minor legal issue. But somewhere between ladling soup and listening to stories of struggle, something had shifted inside her. Father Martinez, the elderly priest who ran the shelter, had been the one to deliver the message. "The Holy Father will be visiting Washington for a private meeting with Catholic leaders," he had said, his weathered hands holding the simple white envelope. "He specifically requested to meet with you, Miss Kardashian. He said he's been following your work with our community." Now, standing before the imposing yet welcoming facade of the papal residence, Kim felt the weight of that moment. The media had been kept at bay. This meeting was deliberately private, away from cameras and speculation. Only a small group of Vatican officials and a single photographer for documentation purposes were present. Sister Margaret, a soft-spoken nun who served as the nuncio's assistant, greeted Kim at the door. "Miss Kardashian, welcome. His Holiness is looking forward to meeting you. He's currently finishing his morning prayers, but he asked me to show you to the garden where you'll be speaking." As they walked through the quiet corridors lined with religious art and photographs of papal visits, Kim found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The past year had been turbulent, a highly publicized divorce, custody battles, and the constant scrutiny of her every move. But it was during her lowest moment, sitting alone in her Calabasas mansion at 3 a.m., that she had made the decision to start volunteering. It wasn't about redemption, she had told her therapist weeks later. It was about finding something real in a world that felt increasingly artificial. The garden was small but beautifully maintained, with roses still blooming despite the October chill. A simple wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree, and Kim could hear the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls, a reminder that life continued its relentless pace even in this pocket of tranquility. "He should be here shortly," Sister Margaret said with a gentle smile. "He prefers these informal settings. He says they allow for more honest conversations." Kim sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about social media posts or business ventures. She was simply present, in this moment, preparing for a conversation that could change everything. Pope Francis appeared in the garden doorway with none of the fanfare that usually accompanied Kim's encounters with world leaders. He wore his simple white cassock and walked with the slight stoop of his 87 years, but his eyes held a warmth that immediately put her at ease. There were no cameras flashing, no entourage, just an elderly man approaching with a genuine smile. "Miss Kardashian," he said in accented English, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Kim stood quickly, suddenly unsure of the protocol. Should she curtsy? Kiss his ring? But Pope Francis simply took her hand in both of his and gestured toward the bench. "Please, let's sit. I've been looking forward to our conversation." They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a cardinal flit between the rose bushes. Kim found herself studying his profile. The weathered face, the kind eyes, the hands that seemed to carry the weight of countless blessings and sorrows. Father Martinez tells me you've been working at the shelter for almost a year now, Pope Francis began, his voice gentle but direct. He says the families there speak of you with great affection, that you remember their names, their stories. Kim felt heat rise in her cheeks. It started as community service, she admitted, court-ordered. But something changed when I met Maria. She's a single mother with 3 kids living in her car. She never complained, never asked for more than what was offered. She had this dignity that I envied. And what did you learn from Maria? The question hung in the air between them. Kim had expected to discuss charity work or public perception. But this felt different, more personal, more searching. I learned that I'd been living in a bubble, she said slowly. That all the things I thought were important, the followers, the brands, the image, none of it mattered when someone couldn't feed their children. Maria taught me what strength really looks like. Pope Francis nodded thoughtfully. In my years serving the church, I've learned that God often uses the most unexpected people to teach us the most important lessons. Maria sounds like one of those. Teachers. Your Holiness, Kim began, then stopped. I'm sorry, I don't know how to address you properly. Francis is fine, he said with a chuckle. Or Papa Francisco, if you prefer. Titles are for ceremonies. This is a conversation between 2 people trying to understand their purpose. The simplicity of his response broke down another wall Kim hadn't even realized she'd built. Francis. Then, I have to ask, why did you want to meet with me? I'm not exactly the type of person the Vatican usually invites for coffee. Pope Francis smiled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Perhaps that's exactly why I wanted to meet you. The Church has spent too much time talking to people who already agree with us. You have a voice that reaches millions of people who might never step inside a cathedral. That's a gift, and gifts are meant to be used for something greater than ourselves. But I've made so many mistakes, Kim said, her voice barely above a whisper. My life has been so public, so messy. How can someone like me possibly represent anything meaningful? St. Peter denied Christ 3 times, Francis replied matter-of-factly. St. Paul persecuted Christians before his conversion. Augustine lived a life of excess before finding God. The Church is built on the foundation of imperfect people who chose to do better. Your mistakes don't disqualify you. They make you human, and humans can relate to other humans. They sat in comfortable silence again, the weight of his words settling between them. Kim felt something shifting inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name but recognized as hope. What would you have me do? She asked finally. Be yourself, Francis said simply. But be the best version of yourself. Use your platform, not to accumulate more followers, but to lift up the voices of people like Maria. Show the world that faith isn't about perfection. It's about love in action. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging from Kim's childhood memories of attending church with her grandmother to Francis's experiences working with the poor in Argentina. As they talked, Kim felt layers of defense and pretense, falling away, replaced by something she hadn't experienced in years: authentic connection. I have a proposition for you, Francis said as their time together began to wind down. But I want you to think carefully before you answer. This isn't something to be undertaken lightly. Kim leaned forward, intrigued. I'm listening. Next month, I'll be visiting several cities across the United States. Not for official Vatican business, but for what I call walking visits. I want to spend time in communities that are often overlooked. Urban neighborhoods struggling with poverty, rural areas forgotten by progress, places where people feel abandoned by both their government and their churches. He paused, watching her carefully. I'd like you to consider joining me for part of this journey, not as a celebrity guest or a photo opportunity, but as someone committed to listening and learning. Your presence would bring attention to these communities, but more importantly, it might help bridge the gap between the church and people who feel excluded from it. Kim's first instinct was to say yes immediately, but something in Francis's tone made her pause. What would that look like? Practically speaking, we would visit homeless encampments, immigration detention centers, communities affected by drug addiction and violence. We'd attend small church services in neighborhoods most people drive through without stopping. We'd eat meals prepared by community volunteers and sleep in parish guest rooms rather than luxury hotels. His eyes met hers directly. It would be uncomfortable, Kim. There would be no cameras documenting your good deeds, no social media moments. Just the hard work of being present with people in their struggles. The magnitude of what he was proposing began to sink in. Kim thought about her usual travel arrangements, private jets, 5-star accommodations, security details that kept her separate from crowds. This would be the opposite of everything she knew. My team would never approve, she said, thinking aloud. The security risks alone, your team works for you, not the other way around. Francis interrupted gently. The question isn't what they would approve, but what you feel called to do. Kim stood and walked to the edge of the garden, looking out at the city beyond the walls. Somewhere out there, people were struggling in ways she was only beginning to understand. The shelter work had opened her eyes, but this would be something entirely different. A complete step outside her comfort zone. Can I ask you something honestly? She turned back to face him. Do you really think I can make a difference? Or am I just another celebrity you're trying to use for publicity? Francis rose and joined her at the garden's edge. If I wanted publicity, I would have invited you to a Vatican ceremony with full media coverage. Instead, I'm asking you to do the work that nobody will see, to show up for people who have been forgotten. That's not publicity, Kim. That's discipleship. The word hung between them. Discipleship. Kim had never thought of herself in those terms, but something about it resonated in a way that surprised her. How long would we be traveling? She asked. 2 weeks. 7 cities. We'd start in Detroit, then move through rural Kentucky, urban Atlanta, the border communities of Texas, Native American reservations in South Dakota, and end in the tent cities of Los Angeles. That's my backyard, Kim said, thinking of the homeless encampments she'd driven past countless times without really seeing them. Exactly. Sometimes we need to leave home to truly see it. Kim closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself in this scenario. No glam squad, no carefully controlled environments, no escape route if things got uncomfortable. It terrified her, and that terror told her something important. If I say yes, she said slowly, I need your promise that this isn't about changing me into someone I'm not. I'm not going to pretend to be a saint or speak in religious language that doesn't feel authentic to me. I wouldn't want you to, Francis replied. The world has enough people trying to sound holy. What we need are people willing to be real. Kim took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Then yes, she said. I'll do it. Francis smiled, but it wasn't the triumphant expression she expected. Instead, it was gentle, almost sad. Are you sure? Because once we begin this journey, it will change you. You won't be able to return to your old life unchanged. The question is whether you're ready for that transformation. Looking into his weathered face, Kim realized she'd been ready for change, long before she walked into this garden. I'm ready, she said, and for the first time in months, she meant it completely. The 3 weeks between Kim's meeting with Pope Francis and the beginning of their journey passed in a whirlwind of preparation and pushback. Her team, as predicted, was unanimous in their opposition to the plan. This is career suicide, declared Jonathan Chaban, her longtime friend and business advisor, pacing across the marble floor of her Hidden Hills home. Your brand is built on luxury, aspiration, exclusivity. What happens when people see you sleeping in church basements and eating at soup kitchens? Kim sat at her kitchen island, laptop open to emails from various team members, each more urgent and concerned than the last. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen, she said quietly. Listen to yourself, interjected her publicist, Amanda, joining the conversation via video call from New York. "You're talking about walking away from everything we've built. The Vatican isn't paying you for this. There's no product placement, no brand partnerships. It's just charity work." "Since when is charity work a bad thing?" Kim asked, feeling a familiar frustration rising. "It's not bad," Amanda replied quickly. "But it's not strategic. We have the fragrance launch next month, the clothing line. Expansion, 3 brand partnerships waiting for your approval. This Pope thing, it's a distraction." Kim looked around her kitchen. The custom Italian marble, the $50,000 refrigerator, the view of perfectly manicured gardens. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and somehow empty. What if I don't want to be strategic anymore? What if I want to do something that matters? The room fell silent. Jonathan stopped pacing and studied her face with the attention of someone who'd known her for over a decade. "This is about the divorce, isn't it? And the custody stuff. You're having some kind of breakdown." "This isn't a breakdown," Kim interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. "This is the opposite of a breakdown. This is the first time in years I've felt like I'm moving toward something instead of running away from it." That evening, after her team had left and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Kim found herself in her daughter North's room. The 9-year-old was working on a school project about social justice heroes, pictures of Martin Luther King, Jr. and Rosa Parks spread across her bed. "Mom, who's your hero?" North asked without looking up from her poster board. The question caught Kim off guard. She could list celebrities, business leaders, fashion icons. But hero? "I'm not sure, baby. Who's yours?" "Right now, it's this lady named Dorothy Day. She helped poor people and went to jail for what she believed in. Sister Mary at school told us about her." North held up a photo she'd printed from the internet. "She wasn't famous like you, but she changed things." Kim studied the black and white photograph of the Catholic social activist. Dorothy Day looked ordinary. No designer clothes, no professional makeup. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of purpose and conviction. "Would you think it was cool if Mommy went on a trip to help people like Dorothy Day did?" North looked up from her project with the serious expression she wore when considering important matters. "Would you be helping kids too?" "Some kids, yes, and their parents. People who don't have homes or enough food." "Then yes, I think it would. Be very cool. But Mom?" North's expression grew more serious. "Would you still be my mom when you came back?" The question hit Kim like a physical blow. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll always be your mom." "Why would you ask that?" "Because sometimes when you go on trips for work, you come back different. Like you're still my mom, but you're also someone else who's thinking about cameras and stuff. I like it better when you're just my mom." That night, Kim couldn't sleep. She stood in her walk-in closet, looking at rows of designer clothes, thinking about North's words. Who was she when the cameras weren't rolling? When there was no audience to perform for, no image to maintain? She pulled out her phone and found herself scrolling through photos from her recent visits to the shelter. There was one of her sitting on the floor with a group of children, helping them with homework. Her hair was in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, and she was laughing at something one of the kids had said. She looked happy. Not the polished, posed happiness of red carpet photos, but genuinely joyful. The next morning, she called a meeting with her core team. "I'm going," she announced before anyone could sit down. "The tour with Pope Francis. I'm doing it." "Kim," Jonathan began. "I'm not asking for your approval," she continued. "I'm asking for your support. Help me figure out how to do this right, or I'll figure it out on my own." The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, her security chief Pascal spoke up. "If you're determined to do this, we need to talk about logistics. The Vatican has its own security, but traveling through these communities, it's not going to be easy." I don't want it to be easy, Kim replied. Easy hasn't gotten me anywhere worth being. Amanda sighed deeply. Okay. If we're doing this, we're doing it all the way. No half measures, no backing out if it gets uncomfortable. And we document everything, not for social media, but for our own records. This could be the start of something bigger. As her team began discussing practical arrangements, Kim felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in her adult life, she was making a decision based not on market research or profit margins, but on what felt right in her heart. 2 days before departure, she received a handwritten letter from Pope Francis. The paper was simple, the handwriting careful but unpretentious. Dear Kim, I've been praying for you as we prepare for this journey. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite the fear. See you in Detroit. With blessings, Francis. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her suitcase next to the plain clothes she'd purchased for the trip. For the first time in years, she was packing light. Detroit in November carried the bite of early winter, and Kim pulled her simple wool coat closer as she stepped out of the modest sedan that had replaced her usual luxury transportation. The city's downtown core showed signs of renewal. New restaurants, renovated buildings, young professionals walking with purpose. But their destination was far from the revitalized areas featured in tourism brochures. Pope Francis was already there when she arrived at Cass Community Social Services, speaking quietly with a group of men gathered around a makeshift fire in an empty lot. He wore a simple black jacket over his white collar, and Kim was struck by how naturally he fit into the urban landscape, as if he belonged there among the forgotten corners of the city. Miss Kim, called out a voice she recognized. Maria, the single mother from the Los Angeles shelter, approached with 3 children in tow. Kim had arranged for several families from her volunteer work to meet them in Detroit, people who wanted to share their stories with Francis. Maria, I can't believe you made it, Kim said, embracing the woman who had taught her about dignity in the face of hardship. How was the trip? Long but worth it, Maria replied, her eyes focused on Pope Francis. I never thought I'd meet a pope. My grandmother would be so proud. The first day set the tone for the entire journey. They visited a community kitchen serving breakfast to day laborers waiting for work, sat with families in a transitional housing program, and spent the evening at a small parish where Francis celebrated Mass in both English and Spanish for a congregation that filled every folding chair and spilled into the adjoining fellowship hall. What struck Kim most wasn't the poverty she witnessed. She'd seen that before, but the resilience and community she found in unexpected places. At the transitional housing facility, she met Denise, a former automotive worker who'd lost her job when the plant closed, and her home when she couldn't make mortgage payments. I was so ashamed, Denise told them as they sat in the facility's common room. I'd worked for 30 years, owned my own home, raised 3 kids. Suddenly I was standing in line for food stamps, sleeping on my sister's couch. I thought I'd failed at everything. What changed? Francis asked, leaning forward with the attention he gave to each person they met. The people here, Denise replied, gesturing around the room where other residents were preparing dinner. They showed me that losing everything doesn't mean you are nothing. We look out for each other here. Mrs. Patterson watches my grandson when I go to job interviews. I help Tommy with his resume because I know about office work. We're family now. That night, Kim lay in the narrow bed of the parish guest room, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the thin walls. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls and hundreds of text messages. Her absence from social media had sparked speculation and concern among her followers. But for the first time in years, the silence felt liberating rather than terrifying. The second day brought them to a needle exchange program in one of Detroit's most struggling neighborhoods. Kim had never been in such close proximity to active drug addiction, and she felt her privilege and naivety acutely as they met with program coordinators and clients. People think we're enabling addiction, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, who ran the high program. But harm reduction saves lives. When someone's ready to get clean, we're here. When they're not ready, we keep them alive until they are. They met Marcus, a 34-year-old veteran who'd been living on the streets for 2 years since his addiction cost him his apartment and his relationship with his daughter. He spoke to Francis with a mixture of respect and skepticism. With all due respect, Your Holiness. Where was God when I was lying in an alley behind a dumpster wishing I'd die? Where was the church when I went to 3 different parishes asking for help and got turned away because I looked too rough? The question hung in the air, and Kim watched Francis's face carefully. She'd grown accustomed to seeing public figures deflect difficult questions with platitudes or talking points, but Francis looked directly at Marcus with what appeared to be genuine pain. God was suffering with you in that alley, Francis said quietly. And the church failed you. I failed. You. We built walls when we should have built bridges. We worried about appearances when we should have worried about souls. He paused, then added, Will you help us do better? The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Marcus, Dr. Chen, and several other program participants sharing their experiences and suggestions. Kim found herself taking notes, not for any business purpose, but because she was learning things about human nature and institutional failure that she'd never encountered in her insulated world. On their 3rd day in Detroit, they visited a community garden in a neighborhood where vacant lots outnumbered occupied houses. The garden was the initiative of a group of elderly women who'd decided to turn abandonment into abundance, growing vegetables that they distributed to anyone in need. The city wanted to tear down everything and start over, explained Mrs. Johnson, the garden's unofficial leader. But we've been here for 60 years. This is our home. We don't need fancy condos. We need jobs and grocery stores and schools that work. But while we're waiting for that, we grow food. As they worked alongside the volunteers, pulling the last tomatoes of the season, preparing beds for winter, Kim found herself in conversation with Francis about systemic change versus individual action. Sometimes I feel like what we're doing is just putting Band-Aids on problems that need surgery, she admitted as they walked between the raised beds. Perhaps, Francis replied, stopping to examine a particularly robust pepper plant. But Mrs. Johnson didn't wait for city council meetings or federal programs. She picked up a shovel and planted seeds. Change often begins with someone willing to start where they are with what they have. That evening, at a community dinner held in the garden's adjacent community center, Kim watched Francis interact with everyone from toddlers to grandparents, switching effortlessly between English and Spanish, listening to stories, sharing meals, and somehow making each person feel as though they were the most important person in the room. How do you do it? She asked him as they walked back to their lodging. How do you stay present for every single person when there are so many needs? So much pain? Francis was quiet for several blocks before responding. I remember that each person is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. Their story matters because they matter. The moment I start seeing people as problems to be solved instead of humans to be loved, I lose my way. As they reached the parish house where they were staying, Kim realized she was beginning to understand what he meant about transformation. 3 days in, she could already feel changes in how she saw the world and her place in it. The question was whether she had the courage to let those changes take root. By the time they reached rural Kentucky, Kim had been away from her regular life for over a week. The mountain communities they visited were struggling with generational poverty, opioid addiction, and the environmental aftermath of coal mining. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills covered in autumn foliage. But the human cost of economic neglect was evident in boarded-up storefronts, abandoned schools, and families doing their best with very little. Their first stop was a small town where the main employer, a coal processing plant, had closed 3 years earlier. Unemployment was over 40%, and many families had lost health insurance along with their jobs. They visited a community health clinic operating out of a converted trailer, staffed by volunteer medical students, and a retired doctor who'd moved to the area specifically to serve this population. "We see everything here," explained Dr. Roberts, washing his hands between patients. "Diabetes, hypertension, depression, addiction, all made worse by the stress of economic uncertainty. People choose between medication and groceries, between heating their homes and paying for doctor visits." Kim met Jennifer, a 42-year-old mother of 3 who'd been a secretary at the coal plant. Without employer-provided insurance, she was rationing her insulin and had been to the emergency room twice in the past month for diabetic episodes. "I keep thinking it'll get better," Jennifer said, as they sat in the clinic's small waiting area. "That someone will reopen the plant or bring in new jobs. But it's been 3 years, and things just keep getting worse. My oldest boy talks about leaving as soon as he finishes high school, and I can't blame him. But what happens to places like this when all the young people leave?" The question haunted Kim as they continued their visits. They spent time at a community center, where volunteers ran after-school programs for children whose parents worked multiple minimum-wage jobs to make ends meet. They visited a food pantry operating out of a Baptist church, where families lined up quietly for groceries, their dignity intact despite their circumstances. That night, staying in a guest room at the local Catholic church, Kim found herself overwhelmed by the cumulative weight of the stories she'd heard. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her phone in her hands, scrolling through messages from her usual world. Brand partnerships worth millions, invitations to exclusive events, business opportunities that would be considered major successes by any measure. The disconnect felt surreal. While she was learning about families choosing between medicine and food, her business manager was texting about a fragrance deal that would earn her more in a single day than most of the people she'd met earned in a year. She walked to the small window and looked out at the quiet main street. A few streetlights illuminated empty storefronts and a diner that advertised breakfast all day in flickering neon. Somewhere out there, Jennifer was probably lying awake worrying about her blood, sugar, and her children's futures. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Kim, it's Francis. May I come in?" She opened the door to find the Pope in simple pajamas and a robe, looking every bit the elderly man he was, rather than the global religious leader. "I saw your light was still on. Are you having trouble sleeping?" "I keep thinking about Jennifer," Kim said, stepping aside to let him in. "And all the others. How do they get up every morning when everything seems so hopeless?" Francis sat in the room's single chair, and Kim returned to the edge of the bed. "I've been asking myself the same question for 40 years of ministry," he said. "And I think the answer is that hope isn't about believing things will get better. Hope is about believing that what we do matters, even when we can't see the results." "But what am I really doing here?" Kim asked, voicing the doubt that had been growing stronger each day. "I'm a rich celebrity playing tourist in other people's suffering. When this trip is over, I'll go back to my mansion and my business deals, and Jennifer will still be rationing insulin. Will you?" Francis asked simply. The question stopped Kim short. "Will I what? Will you go back unchanged? Because the Kim I met 3 weeks ago might have done that. But the woman sitting in this room, asking these questions, wrestling with these concerns, I'm not sure she can return to business as usual." Kim felt tears threatening, an unusual occurrence for someone who'd trained herself to maintain composure in any situation. "I don't know how to help on the scale that's needed. My problems seem so ridiculous now. I was upset about custody arrangements and business negotiations while people are choosing between medicine and food. Your problems don't become less real because others have different problems," Francis said gently. "But your perspective on those problems, and your responsibility to use your gifts for something larger than yourself, that can change." "What if I can't handle it?" Kim asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "What if I'm not strong enough, or good enough, or smart enough to make a real difference?" Francis was quiet for a long moment, and Kim worried she'd said too much, revealed too much vulnerability to this man she was still getting to know. "In my experience," he finally said, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. The question isn't whether you're good enough, Kim. The question is whether you're willing to try, to fail, to learn, and to try again. The next morning brought their most challenging visit yet. A family whose teenage son had died from a fentanyl overdose 2 months earlier. Kim almost asked to skip this meeting, feeling unprepared to face such raw grief. But Frances insisted. They go together. Tom and Linda Morrison sat in their small living room, surrounded by photos of their son Jake, Little League pictures, high school graduation, family vacations to nearby lakes. Linda clutched a pillow that still smelled like her son's cologne. He wasn't a bad kid, Tom said, his voice carefully controlled. Good grades, played baseball, had a job at the hardware store. But he hurt his back in a game, got prescribed pain pills, and when the prescription ran out, he couldn't finish the sentence. We found him in his bedroom, Linda whispered. He'd bought pills from someone at school, but they were laced with fentanyl. He probably didn't even know. They sat with the Morrisons for 2 hours, mostly listening, occasionally, offering words of comfort that felt inadequate in the face of such loss. As they prepared to leave, Linda grabbed Kim's hands. "Promise me you'll tell people about Jake," she said urgently. Not as a cautionary tale or a statistic, but as a boy who mattered, who was loved, who deserved better than what this world gave. Him, walking back to their car, Kim felt something breaking open inside her chest. "I can't do this," she said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. "I can't keep meeting these people and feeling so helpless. It's too much." Francis stopped beside her, his hand gently touching her elbow. "This is the moment," he said quietly. "This is where you choose who you want to become." "What do you mean?" "You can walk away from this pain, return to your comfortable life, and pretend these problems don't exist. Many people make that choice, and I don't judge them for it. Or you can let this breaking open be the beginning of something new. A commitment to carry these stories with you, to use your voice and resources to ensure that Jake Morrison and Jennifer and all the others aren't forgotten." Kim looked back, at the Morrison house, where she could see Linda standing at the window, watching them leave. What if I fail them? What if you don't try? The question followed her for the rest of the day, and into another sleepless night. By morning, she had her answer. The final days of their journey took them through the border communities of Texas, Native American reservations in South Dakota, and finally to the homeless encampments of Los Angeles, Kim's own backyard, as Frances had predicted. Each stop deepened her understanding of how complex social issues intersected: immigration policy, historical trauma, mental health, addiction, economic inequality, and systemic racism all woven together in ways that defied simple solutions. But it was, returning to Los Angeles, to the tent cities she'd driven past countless times without truly seeing, that completed her transformation. "I used to think homelessness was about individual choices," Kim admitted to Frances as they walked through a camp under a freeway overpass in downtown LA. Personal failures, addiction, mental illness, problems that individuals needed to solve for themselves. "And now?" Frances asked, stepping carefully around someone's belongings. "Now I see how many systems have to fail simultaneously for someone to end up living on the street, and how many barriers exist to getting back into housing, employment, healthcare, stability." They stopped to talk with Carlos, a veteran who'd been living in the camp for 8 months after losing his apartment when his disability payments were delayed. His tent was organized like a military barracks, everything in its place, despite having almost nothing. "People think we're lazy or crazy," Carlos told them. "But I get up every morning, I keep my area clean, I look for work when I can. This isn't where I want to be, but it's where the system put me when everything else fell apart." As their 2-week journey came to an end, Kim found herself dreading the return to her normal life. They had one final dinner together at the downtown LA parish where they'd been staying, sharing a simple meal with staff and volunteers who worked with the homeless population. "What happens now?" Kim asked Frances as they walked through the church's small garden after dinner. "How do I take what I've learned and turn it into something meaningful? That's not a question I can answer for you," Frances replied. "But I can tell you that transformation isn't a destination. It's a daily choice. Every morning, you'll wake up and decide whether to honor what you've seen and learned, or to let the comfort of your old life pull you back." They sat on a bench beneath a statue of St. Francis of Assisi, the Pope's namesake. The city hummed around them. Traffic, sirens, the distant sounds of people living their lives in whatever circumstances they found themselves. "I've been thinking about something Linda Morrison said," Kim continued, "about telling Jake's story, not as a cautionary tale but as a boy who mattered. I think that's what all of this has been about, learning to see people as who they are, not as problems to be solved or statistics to be managed." "And how will you do that? Tell their stories?" Kim pulled out her phone, not to check messages for the first time in 2 weeks, but to show Frances something she'd been working on during their quiet moments. "I've been writing, not for social media, not for publicity, but just writing. About Maria and Jennifer and the Morrisons and Carlos, their own words, their own stories." Frances read through several pages on her phone, his expression thoughtful. "These are beautiful, Kim, honest, full of dignity for the people you've met. I want to do something with them. Not a book deal or a documentary, something that actually helps. I keep thinking about what you said about hope being the belief that what we do matters, even when we can't see the results. What are you thinking?" Kim took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a decision that would fundamentally change her life. "I want to use my platform differently. Not to promote products or maintain an image, but to amplify voices like theirs. And I want to put my money where my mouth is, create a foundation that funds the kind of grassroots work we've seen on this trip." Frances nodded slowly. "That sounds like a worthy calling. But Kim, you need to understand that this path will cost you things. Some of your current business opportunities, some relationships, certainly some of the comfortable distance between you and the world's pain. Are you prepared for that?" "I don't know," Kim answered honestly. "But I know I can't go back to pretending I haven't seen what I've seen. My daughter asked me once if I'd still be her mom when I came back from this trip. I think the answer is yes. But I'll be a different kind of mom, one who teaches her that privilege is a responsibility, not just a blessing." The next morning, Kim's final conversation with Frances took place in the airport departure lounge. His flight to Rome was boarding first, and they had only a few minutes before he had to leave. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his simple carry-on bag. He pulled out a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling. "This belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to me when I first felt called to serve God, and I've carried it ever since." Kim accepted the cross with trembling hands. "I can't. Take this. It's too important. Exactly why you should have it," Frances interrupted gently. "It will remind you that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up, day after day, for the people who need us most." As his boarding group was called, Frances embraced Kim with the same warmth he'd shown everyone they'd met on their journey. "Remember," he whispered, "you don't have to change the whole world. Just the part of it you can reach. 3 months. Later, Kim stood in the same downtown LA parish where she and Frances had shared their final dinner. But this time, she wasn't passing through. She was launching the Dignity Initiative, a foundation focused on amplifying the voices of people experiencing poverty, homelessness, and social marginalization. The launch event wasn't held in a luxury hotel ballroom or a trendy venue. Instead, it took place in the parish hall, with folding chairs and donated flowers, attended by the people whose stories had inspired the foundation's creation. Maria was there with her children, now living in permanent supportive housing. Carlos, had secured part-time work and was transitioning out of the encampment. Jennifer had traveled from Kentucky, her diabetes now managed with the help of a sliding-scale clinic the foundation had helped fund. "This isn't about me," Kim told the gathering, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This is about the teachers I've met over the past few months, people who showed me what strength, dignity, and community really look like. My job isn't to speak for you, but to make sure you have platforms to speak for yourselves." The foundation's first initiative was a storytelling project, not a traditional documentary or social media campaign, but a series of community conversations where people could share their experiences in their own words, recorded and distributed through local media, community organizations, and digital platforms designed to reach policymakers and the public. 6 months after returning from her journey with Pope Francis, Kim received a letter from the Vatican. Francis had written to thank her for the Foundation's work and to share that he'd been following the stories being collected and shared through the Dignity Initiative. "You have learned to see with the eyes of the heart," he wrote. "This is perhaps the greatest gift we can offer each other, the recognition that every person carries within them a story worth hearing, a dignity worth defending, and a contribution worth making to our shared human family." Kim folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the wooden cross on her desk. Around her, the Foundation's small office buzzed with activity. Staff coordinating with community partners, volunteers organizing storytelling events, researchers documenting the impact of grassroots programs. It wasn't the life she'd planned, and it certainly wasn't the life her former team had envisioned for her. She'd turned down millions in endorsement deals, scaled back her business ventures, and redirected most of her public attention toward work that generated headlines only when policy changed or lives improved. But as she looked at the photos on her office wall, images from their journey, pictures from Foundation events, faces of people whose stories were now being heard, Kim realized that Pope Francis had been right about transformation. It wasn't a destination, but a daily choice, and each morning she chose to honor what she'd learned from the teachers who'd shown her what really mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from North. "Mom, I saw the news story about the housing program you helped fund. Are you still my mom?" Kim smiled, remembering their conversation from months ago. She typed back, "Always and forever, but hopefully a better version of the mom you've always had." Outside her office window, Los Angeles continued its restless pace. People rushing to appointments, chasing dreams, building lives in whatever circumstances they found themselves. But Kim no longer saw it as background noise. She saw it as a community, full of stories waiting to be heard and dignity waiting to be recognized. The world had indeed been moved by Pope Francis's gesture involving Kim Kardashian, but perhaps not in the way anyone had expected. It wasn't a single moment of viral compassion or a photo opportunity for social media. Instead, it was the quiet, ongoing work of transformation. One conversation, one story, one act of recognition at a time. And in her desk drawer, next to business, cards and meeting notes, Kim kept a small piece of paper with words Francis had spoken during one of their final conversations. "The church is not a museum for saints, but a hospital for sinners seeking to become healers." She had learned to see herself not as a celebrity doing charity work, but as someone who had been wounded by the world's pain and was now committed to helping others heal. It was harder work than anything she'd done before, and somehow, it was exactly what she'd been looking for all along.